So the final score is for big tech, for investment banking, which makes our career choice winner in this video. If you're an ambitious university student on track to graduate with some kind of business degree, or even a young professional working an entry-level corporate job, then you might have heard of a few different career paths that tend to promise high earnings, prestige, and a path to early retirement. In this video, we're going to cover two of these popular options: investment banking and business roles at a big tech company. For those of you who are unfamiliar with these types of career options, I'll briefly describe these types of companies. First, we have investment banking, and here we'll focus on the big name bulge bracket banks like Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, Citi, Barclays, etc. Investment banks typically perform two main functions. There's the financing side, where they help companies raise money through things like issuing stocks and bonds. And then there's the advisory side, where they help with strategic finance decisions like where we should invest our cash or how we should go about a potential merger or acquisition. Then we have our other career option in this video, which is business roles at big tech. So when we say big tech, we're talking about the classic big FANG companies, or Facebook, which is now known as Meta, then Apple, Amazon, Netflix, and Google, and then some other new ones like Tesla, Uber, Airbnb, etc. These large tech corporations have a whole string of different business roles, from things like FP&A, which stands for Finance Planning and Analysis, to things like business operations, business strategy, sales and marketing, accounting, and more. We'll be comparing these two job options using a 5-star scoring system built into 4 key categories that we've identified as important job aspects. These 4 job aspects are work culture, compensation, work hours, and career path. Now, before I get started, I do want to acknowledge that there are several other popular business career paths like management consulting, commercial real estate, and asset management. So drop us a comment if you want to hear us explore some of these other career paths. All right, so let's start with our first job aspect, work culture. Work culture is really important because it strongly influences your day-to-day experience as an employee working on a team. This is often linked to things like job satisfaction, mental and physical health, as well as internal career development opportunities. If you take a look at business roles at big tech, you'll see that there's actually quite a lot of variation between the different firms. Some of the traditionally favored big tech companies include Google and Apple, who are famous for giving their employees luxurious perks like free fitness facilities, massage rooms, napping pods, gourmet meals, and much more. Although these companies might start cutting back on some of these luxuries, as many have already initiated layoffs and spending cutbacks through the economic downturn. And although these companies showcase a lot of luxury, you really shouldn't be fooled by the cover, because many of these companies still push for lean teams that work at a strong pace. With my experience at Tesla, I often found that the company ran super lean teams, which meant we all worked pretty hard to keep up with the innovative drive of the company. And then there are a handful of other tech companies that have had their fair share of corporate work scandals and work culture mishaps. Then you have the ironically smaller big tech companies like Snapchat and DoorDash, where you might actually find it easier to make friends amongst a smaller group that still has that last bit of late startup energy to it. Other considerations that can sometimes be overlooked include work location and work commute, and how that links to company culture. In big tech, you'll often find that many headquarters and offices are often located in the West Coast of the United States, particularly in the General Bay Area or Northern California. This is apparent with companies like Google, Apple, Meta, LinkedIn, and Netflix, who all have large headquarters in Northern California. This is an important consideration, especially given how the lifestyle on the West Coast can be considerably different from what you can find on the East Coast in places like New York, Chicago, and Boston. Many folks who do end up moving to the West Coast often purchase a car because residential and working areas just aren't that close together, and public transport isn't as convenient. That being said, it seems like many of these big tech companies also have offices on the East Coast, but these operations seem to be a bit smaller and sometimes reserved for more senior, non-entry level roles. Now, in addition to office locations, we should also take a look at a company's view on remote work. Elon Musk and his general involvements with Tesla, Twitter, and SpaceX has a quite published view on being against remote working. Outside of this, it seems like many of the other big tech companies are still okay with a remote or hybrid work schedule. Although it'll be interesting to see if this changes with the recent layoffs and economic pressures on these companies. Overall, these larger, more established tech companies, at least relative to the fast pace of Wall Street, seem to give their employees a relatively relaxed and more approachable work environment, so we'll give them a 3 out of 5 for work culture. Now let's take a look at the investment banks. With investment banking, you'll probably see a more consistent work culture or work lifestyle across the different firms, as it's no secret that investment bankers on Wall Street work super long hours at a fast pace with relatively high levels of stress. It's very common for investment bankers to work on the weekends, so if work-life balance is important for you, then you might want to reconsider a career in investment banking. Unfortunately, employee burnout is quite common in this industry, so we do recommend taking a good second to consider the heavy work hours and how realistic that might be for you. We'll cover the actual compensation and work hour estimates later in this video, so stick around if you want to hear more on those details. Okay, so some have reported that investment banking can be quite repetitive, as they often use similar presentation decks and financial models. Now I know we briefly talked about the long hours, but there is a flipped perspective to that. Because investment bankers work such long hours, you could actually argue that the employees are more likely to create close bonds with one another because they're spending so much time together throughout the day and through working late nights. So if you're looking for your workplace BFF, then this might be the place for you. Alright, now what about work location and work commutes? The heart of investment banking seems to live in New York City, also known as the city that never sleeps. The lifestyle here can be quite different from what you might find in the West Coast, with the cold winters being unpleasant for some, but more importantly, the rent and the cost of living in New York can be extremely high, with average studio rentals hitting $3,200 per month. Most people who live in the city don't own a car, as public transport via the subway is very typical. Some may consider crime and safety to be an issue in New York City, although many have reported that people are just fine when sticking to the main roads and visible public areas. Now, there are investment banking offices in the west coast of the United States, but these operations are typically much smaller, and they still take place in very municipal, city-like places like San Francisco and Los Angeles. In terms of remote work, it seems like these banks are split between two different remote working philosophies. Citigroup and UBS at the company level seem to be bigger fans of a hybrid work schedule, although this may be team dependent, as investment banking teams in particular are quite well known for their late office hours and general face time with colleagues and clients. Other banks like Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, and Morgan Stanley seem to be pretty strictly against remote and hybrid work schedules. So, with everything considered, we'll give investment banking a 2 out of 5 stars for work culture. Alright, so now let's jump into the juicy details with job aspect number 2 on compensation. Business analysts at big tech companies are typically paid a year one compensation of around $80,000 to $120,000 per year. Now, some of this compensation can be a bit hard to predict because it's typically broken down into 3 key pieces: your signing bonus, your base pay, and your stock compensation. Your signing bonus is a one-time fixed payment of around $5,000 to $10,000, and then you have your base pay, which is typically around $70,000 to $90,000 per year, and then you have your stock compensation, which can be anywhere between $10,000 to $30,000 per year. So overall, let's give business roles at big tech an annual compensation of around $100,000. That being said, stock compensation can be a bit tricky, especially since much of your stock has to vest or sit locked up, and that's usually about a year for new analysts. And in that time that stock is vesting, the value of that stock can change quite a bit because a lot can happen in 1 year's time in the market. Alright, so with all of this in mind, we'll give business roles at big tech a 3 out of 5 for compensation. Now let's hop back into investment banking. It's not breaking news that investment bankers are paid well over the 6-figure mark, especially given how demanding and competitive the job is. Investment bankers in New York City are typically paid a signing bonus, some kind of base salary, and an end-of-year performance bonus. A first-year analyst signing bonus is typically between $10,000 to $15,000. Then for the base pay, which was recently raised in 2021, typically sits between $100,000 to $125,000 per year. Now for the performance bonus, that's typically dependent on the bank performance and your performance as an individual. Reports online provide quite a large range, between $30,000 to $70,000, but as of late, the economic climate has been quite poor for a lot of these investment banking teams, so maybe you should expect to earn somewhere on the lower end of that scale. With all of that in mind, we'll assign investment banking analysts an annual compensation of around $170,000 for their first year. One final note here is that elite boutique investment banks like Centerview, Evercore, and Lazard tend to pay on the higher end of the scale, so if you work for one of those companies, you can expect to earn something closer to $200,000 per year. Okay, so with that said, we'll give investment banking a 5 out of 5 stars for compensation. Alright, so the scores are pretty close here, so stick around for the rest of the video to see who comes out on top. Alright. Now let's jump into job aspect number 3, which covers the other hot topic in weekly work hours. Business teams in big tech work significantly fewer hours than your average investment banker. Some companies and some teams may work more than others, but you can typically expect to work between 40 to 60 hours per week, with much lighter work expectations over the weekend. Now here's where things get interesting. If you combine the hourly work estimate with the expected total compensation, and say you make about $100,000 a year, working 50 hours a week for 50 out of the 52 weeks in a year, then you would have an hourly pay rate of about $40 per hour. One thing to note here is that work expectations can vary by team and by time of year. So if it's end of the month or end of the quarter, and you work on the finance or accounting team, you might be pushed to work longer hours to make sure all the deliverables and finance and accounting reports are completed by the set deadline. With all things considered, we think that working 50 hours per week is not bad, as it still allows you to enjoy your nights and weekends. And given your hourly pay rate of about $40 per hour and a reasonably good work-life balance, we give business roles at big tech a 5 out of 5 for work hours. Alright, now let's look at investment banking, which is pretty notorious for their really long work hours. Investment bankers typically work between 70 to even as high as 100 hours per week, where analysts are also expected to work quite a bit over the weekend. In recent years, more banks began implementing no-work Saturday rules and protected weekends to help maintain the mental and physical health of their analysts, but it does seem like the enforceability of these rules varies quite a lot between different companies and specific teams. From an hourly pay perspective, if we were to assume $170,000 in annual compensation per year and about 85 hours per week for 50 out of 52 weeks per year, then you'll arrive at a figure close to $40 per hour. Overall, the working hours estimate at 70 to 100 hours per week is really quite poor, and the hourly pay at $40 per hour is the same as the hourly pay as business roles in big tech. So with that in mind, we're going to give investment banking a 1 out of 5 stars for working hours. Now let's jump into the final job aspect, covering the analyst career path. When looking at the career path of a business analyst in big tech, you can see that they can pursue several different career paths. The first option is to simply stay on a corporate finance or business team and work your way up through the different ranks like associate, manager, director, etc., all the way up to those very senior positions like CEO, CFO, or CMO. You could do this by staying at one company or by bouncing between similar companies for a really long time, or you might consider joining a smaller, startup-like company where you might find it easier to climb the ranks quickly in a faster growing company. Alternatively, some business analysts may consider transitioning into something else like asset management, or even an investment firm that specializes in investing in big tech companies or the tech space that you specifically focus in. Another thing that you should consider is the training programs at these companies, which can help you better develop at the junior level and potentially help you better progress into senior level roles at these companies. Training within these big tech companies will vary quite a lot by the company, as the larger, more established companies will probably have better structured programs, while the younger, more startup-like companies will have more unstructured methods of training. Based on my experience at Tesla, I'd say the company didn't have a particular or specific finance training program for new employees, and many of the people there used the term drinking out of the fire hose, which really meant you just had to throw yourself into big and challenging projects to try to just learn as you go. That said, I will say that you might have a different experience at some of the other tech companies, as companies like Apple and Amazon are known for their business and finance rotation programs that allow university graduates to rotate through different teams and different positions, usually through 4 6-month rotations that last about 2 years. All things considered, we think that the career path for a corporate business analyst is quite flexible, so we'll give it a 4 out of 5 stars. Alright, now let's look at investment banking. Those who decide to stick with a traditional investment banking career path will find a pretty structured career path with pretty significant pay jumps at each step of the ladder. It'll take most about 2 to 4 years of work before being considered for a promotion, where an analyst can work their way up to an associate, a VP, a senior VP, and then eventually a managing director, where annual compensation can reach over $1 million. That said, it's also not uncommon for investment bankers to transition into other career paths like private equity, hedge funds, asset management, corporate finance, and many other different finance and investment career paths. Investment bankers seeking higher compensation will typically look for jobs with private equity firms and hedge funds. For those unfamiliar with investment banking training, new analysts typically spend their first few weeks of the job in more of a classroom setting, where they go through a technical training program covering financial modeling and other fundamental finance knowledge. As you can imagine, this kind of training makes investment bankers really recruitable for private equity teams, hedge funds, and other finance and investment teams, as they really want to bring in these people who are pre-trained and ready to go. Other analysts that transition out of investment banking might do so simply to find more work-life balance at other companies. Overall, because investment bankers are known to work really long hours with a very technical finance skill set, it makes them very recruitable for many different lines of work. With this in mind, we give investment banking a 5 out of 5 for the career path aspect. Okay, so the final score is 15 out of 20 for big tech to 13 out of 20 for investment banking, which makes business roles at big tech our career choice winner in this video. Drop us a note in the comment section if you agree, disagree, or would prefer a different career path altogether. I will acknowledge that different people will weigh different job aspects differently, so there are certainly no perfect answers for everyone. With that in mind, if you found this video useful, feel free to give us a like and subscribe, and we'll catch you in the next one.